This is Religion and Theology, a podcast from the Center for Theology and Religious Studies. This episode is the last part of the Heidegger and Theology series ongoing on the podcast. And the episode consists of the finalizing panel discussion in which all the previous speakers partake, along with the moderator that opens up the discussion, Göran Rosenberg. Even though there were a back and forth between the panelists and the audience at the end of the roundtable or panel discussion, the last word, as it were, is given to Professor Hans Ruin, simply because of the poor quality of sound coming from the audience questions.
I have been listening carefully. I've been preparing as much as I could before, and I will try to make us talk about, again, the topic of this conference, Heidegger and Theology after the Black Notebooks. And really, I have tried to extract from the interventions what actually have the Black Notebooks meant. What have they changed in our perception of Heidegger? And here I speak, and perhaps I can then share this position with others who have been at the seminar. I share a certain ignorance of what the whole work and the whole matter of Heidegger, to say the least. But I recognize certain figures that have come back that are linked to the appearance of these Black Notebooks, and they seem to add to the perception of Heidegger the notion or the impression or the fact that in the Black Notebooks he takes harsh issue not only with religions and theology in abstract, but with Christianity as such, acerbically, someone said, and indirectly, or perhaps more fundamentally, with the Jewish roots of that Christianity. So in these books, that's all well known. He introduces terms that were not there before in the works that were published, like the ominous and malevolent role of something called Weltjudentum. This is written in the 30s, so it's natural that it has shaken a lot of shaken the image of Heidegger among people, even among Heidegger scholars, perhaps for and foremost among Heidegger scholars. And I notice with Peter Travny, who's really to be counted among them, a certain, even when I read you, a sense of shock and bitterness towards this Heidegger who comes out now in term and uses terminology that really has to be termed or associated with anti-Semitism and language taken more or less out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Well, that's one thing. So what does that mean, that Heidegger has come out in this way and linked it into his philosophy, we might say? So what have changed by this? And one more thing that I have really been impressed by is the change, apparently, in the Black Notebooks of Heidegger from being a philosopher of, well, this is here my ignorance will show, but of some being, of some living in the being, without really affiliating or associated it with any political action, not with any movement of some kind. It seems like it's a philosophy of how to relate to the fact that we are in this world and how we... Anyway, in the Black Notebooks, this philosophy is clearly linked to action. It's linked to a particular event in contemporary history, National Socialism. and then seems to bring about a change in his view, in his philosophy as a whole. Whether there is philosophy remaining, which Peter Travny somehow at the point doubted. So I will start asking, and I will start with Peter Travny, if you would summarize, and then I would like all of you to comment, and we'll go from there. If you would summarize all of it, what after the black notebooks, has changed in our view of Heidegger, and in Heidegger's role in present day, both, I would say, theology and philosophy. Would you like to set off, Peter? Or was that too much?
What a easy question.
Yeah, I know.
The easiest way to respond to it is to say I don't know. Well, there are a few ways, of course, you can think about. Maybe to start with this, you can, for instance, say what many people will do now, that there is a Heidegger of the 20s where we don't have these problems, where the what I use this term in my book, where the text is not contaminated by anti-Semitism, where he still asks for a universal dimension of science. After being in time, it is 3 years he is dealing with this perspective. And then 33 happens something what brings forth a totally different Heideggerian philosophy, and we can only reject this. So we can say being in time will remain, of course, because it's one of the and well then 50 years nothing. And maybe the latest things about technology will also remain, because this I guess that many scholars will go this path. The others will. The other thing is that people will think about the possibility whether also the early texts are in a certain way integrated into an anti-Judaistic, anti-Semitic discourse, and I guess it's in a certain way it's possible to do this, and they will of course reject Heidegger as such. You see that the work of Immanuel Faye will go this way, that he will say let's see Heidegger as only a national socialist philosopher, and that is of course the end of him as a philosopher. Well, the third way could only be this, that you have to be very careful, or even more careful in reading Heidegger, that the hermeneutics must be more critical than before, and that that we have to be aware of the problem we weren't aware before the publication of the Black Notebooks. And I guess this is for me it would be the only way to go on, to be aware of the huge problems, not only concerning anti-Semitism, but of course concerning this topic of mythology, this topic of the end of philosophy. That he, for instance, says that what he does is not philosophy. That's something what now must be, in my eyes, must be taken more seriously. So I can just say that I can go on with this. But what in general now will happen with Heidegger, I don't know.
But can the old Heidegger be read the same way? I mean, can you have the first solution? It's okay, we have time and being, and we have this and that.
In my eyes, it's impossible, of course. of course, there must be a hermeneutics of suspicion in every respect, in every writing. For instance, take Being and Time. Take something like Das Mann. If he speaks in the 20s, he speaks of die Verjudung der deutschen Universität oder der deutschen Kultur. Verjudung, we don't know how to translate that. In a certain way, there will be critics who will say, well, Das Mann is actually an anti-Semitic thought. It's an anti-Semitic category.
Well, which would be an anti-Semitic category?
Das Mann in the we or whatever, the they or whatever, the how you can.
Das Mann.
Yeah, Das Mann. So there will be readings like this, and I understand that. Well, I call it a hermeneutics of suspicion because it's not written there. So we will always have to discuss it because people will say it's not written there, so and so on. But nevertheless, we will have this problem. We will have this problem that certain topics of Heideggerian philosophy will always be now in the under the suspicion of being anti-Judaistic or anti-Semitic. I guess that's one of the consequences of the Black Notebooks.
Just could leave the microphone to George and then to Judith. I will ask you, and I will just add a little twist since you come from the point of view of theology. Parts of theology have been inspired by Heidegger, no doubt. How will the Black Notebooks change the relationship as you see it between, or the reception of Heidegger into present day theology, or even the revision of past receptions?
And I think broadly, I can only repeat what Peter has been saying, that clearly all of Heidegger will now be read with more suspicious eyes, but actually not much more suspicious eyes, because after all Heidegger was not it was a public knowledge that he became a member of the Nazi Party in 1933 in a very public way. He was not allowed to teach after 1945, so people have known ever since then that for some of his career at least Heidegger was a member of this genocidal party. So, it's not total news in a sense that he shared some views with some other Nazis.
But the anti-Christians...
But that also was known because, although in the early 1920s he speaks of himself in a letter to Karl Löwit as a theologian, but it's also by the time of Being in Time, Judith has mapped this progression very well. He's systematically regarding himself as atheistic. Again, the lecture on phenomenology and theology has been long published, as have other works. The comments about theology that I quoted in how theology will read Hölderlin been published now for a long time. So many aspects of his negative views of Christianity have long been known as well. I think interestingly for me, what perhaps the Black Books do bring out is the sort of. And when Heinrich Ott's book on Heidegger, A Political Life, was published, one of the points he makes is that during his time as rector, Heidegger was particularly hostile in his speeches about Roman Catholicism, and a lot of people sort of said, well, why? And Ott himself sort of seemed to think this was rather coming out of the blue, but in a sense that the Black Books, I think, fill that picture out a little bit as to why Catholic theology in particular, or how Catholic theology in particular became this object that he saw as challenging. But I think there are other elements, as it were, non-surprise. My very strong hunch, having taught in Oxford and Cambridge for a total of 20 years, is that if you actually had the private notebooks or the high-table dinner conversations recorded of academics in Oxford and Cambridge in the 1930s, you would have heard anti-Semitic comments pretty similar to those of Heidegger being traded. Anti-Semitism is an extraordinary commonplace of European life up to 1945. One could say even someone like Karl Barth, who's credited with reopening Christian-Jewish conversation during the 1940s, can write that in the Jew we see human sinfulness manifest. The Jew is the summation of human sinfulness, but we shouldn't turn our eyes away because that's our sinfulness too.
Yeah,
but nevertheless,
he was aware of his.
But the Jew is singled out. He doesn't say the Swiss or the German or the Russian, but the Jew is singled out as the manifestation and the embodiment of human sinfulness in an exceptional way. And this is quite. I'm not trying to normalise anti-Semitism, and I'm not wanting to exculpate Heidegger. But I am saying that it was not normative in any sense, but it was far more commonplace than maybe we would like to think, even in the democratic countries.
But I don't think that's an issue here. At least not for me. That's clear. He wasn't. That was known, and the atmosphere of the time, we know that. But the question is, of course, again, here's and that was taken up by several. He comes out in a much more acerbic way. An animosity against Christianity and the whole legacy, which is, of course, the Jewish legacy.
Well, only partly. Let's see what he says about the English, for example. In one of the last sentences he said, the calculating spirit is Jewish, that the Jews are to blame for modern democracy, for Bolshevism and all that. Actually, he says it was the English Revolution, though he's, again, does no sort of ontic historiographical work, so we don't know whether he means Cromwell or 1688 or the Industrial Revolution, but he says it was the English Revolution that provided the pattern for Bolshevism. English mercantilism, the English profit motive, this is this kind of source of calculability in the modern world. So sometimes he'll grab at the Jews.
So we shouldn't take him too seriously, simply. He says
a lot of
such things about everybody.
Well, yeah, he very much homogenizes.
Yeah,
he criticizes, the prevailing worldview for homogenizing nature and the world into.
Probably blame the English too, of course.
Well, of course.
So you go on, Judith, and then sort of take your time.
No, sorry. Do you want to say? But he homogenizes all these very different movements into simply the same old thing, the same old, calculating technological metaphysics. So that's something we should always remember. I agree. I agree with George. I don't think that the anti-Semitic statements are at the center of what should make us suspicious about Heidegger more than we have been before. As George said, anti-Semitism is such a commonplace in Western culture. And I speak as myself Jewish. It's not, I think there is, however, probably a difference that the notebooks should make for our theological reception of Heidegger. And that has to do partly with the sort of hermeneutics of suspicion, I suppose, that Peter was mentioning. There has been a tendency, I think, in theology to see Heidegger as somehow oracular, something that can move us beyond the impasses or the sort of staleness of Christianity. And if you see Heidegger in this oracular way, then you hold on to his statements almost as prophetic or as pointing beyond where we are now. That's a route that's no longer open to us, I think, in quite the same way, because we can't trust him as much as we'd like to. But concretely, I think there are two things that they change. One, the way that the early Heidegger has been received in theology has often gone along the lines of that we should adopt, and Bultmann does this very much, that we should adopt his separation of a Christian sense of constitutive anxiety and uncertainty and so forth from any hope of something outward coming in. And that's exemplified in Being and Time, of course, and Christians or theologians have tried to adopt that. But of course it now seems as if he himself no longer believed that that was a possibility, even 7 years later. And that has to give us pause. We might respond to that by saying, well, he was right before and then he went wrong. But the fact that he himself doesn't hold on to that is significant, I think. And the second one is that the way that the later Heidegger's work has often been taken over into theology is the anti-metaphysical impulse, obviously, similar in some ways to the reception of the early work. We have to reject God as somehow a securing framework, something that gives us a grasp of the world, in favour of something post-metaphysical, sort of a culture or a disposition of receptivity and quietness and so forth, which of course is there in the mystical tradition of Christianity itself. But it seems so much in the Black Notebooks, for the first time we see the beginnings of Heidegger's post-metaphysical thinking. And those beginnings seem to be very much, as I said before, caught up in the sort of romantic nationalism of the 19th century. It doesn't quite seem as post-metaphysical anymore. And so I think we do need to rethink what we can learn from Heidegger in that regard. I think, as much as always, Heidegger can point us back to anti-metaphysical theological material that we've always had, and he works as well as ever as somebody who calls us to thinking, who calls us to questioning and so forth, but the answers that he himself offers might no longer be so reliable.
Is he undermining himself in a way by moving into this phase where he really introduces into his system this expectation of something imminent to happen in the Ariadnes or
Well, I think he's undermining some of what we thought he was doing. I obviously, to him this is immensely important, and he sees it as the center of what he and every philosopher should be striving for. So of course, one of the tasks that the Black Notebook set us is to grapple with what exactly it was that he thought was so important, and we should have enough trust in Heidegger to think that it's probably worth grappling with. And I don't know yet what will come out of that.
But what's your own thinking? This is your field. I mean, where would you start after this now, if you want to rescue or to somehow reread it in a way that it is still?
Well, I mean, the work that I've been doing since has been to go back to 19th century philosophical engagements with eschatology, because I think that's immensely important. And I'm trying to get a much better systematic grip on how Christian eschatological ideas were reworked in general or non-Christian 19th century philosophy, because I want to understand more clearly what it is that Heidegger just takes over from before and where it is that he introduces new ideas. Because I think, as you've been saying several times, the last God is very clearly, at least in structure and eschatological idea, we need to get a firmer grip of what is new and what is not new. So that's what I'm doing now, and we'll see what that brings.
So I cannot speak for theology, but I take your question as a question: what's happening with Heidegger in philosophy? And picking up on Peter also, I remember when first hearing of this material in the Schwarze Hefte from my very close colleague and friend Masja Sakawalkante-Schubak, who is also a close friend of Peter. And she was getting these materials directly from you, Peter, and at an early stage when you were working on it, you were sitting with this material and you didn't even know what to do with it at first. So I know that you two were in contact. She was one of the people that you were discussing with. So it was clear to you when you found these, even though the material is minuscule compared to the amount of text in these diaries, it was very clear for you from the start that this would change things. And this is what she communicated also, so we had long discussions about it, and it was almost like the sense was there is a storm coming when this material is out. And the reason for this is, of course, the question of anti-Semitism from within this context is the sort of the specific and most painful part of this whole history that we are trying to come to terms with still after 70 years. And even though, of course, it was known, well, as you say, all the facts about Heidegger's rectorate and his party membership was known, this was the one thing that the people who were reading Heidegger and learned from him were saying, well, he was not an anti-Semite. Of course, there were certain rumors, the Husserl family, the Cassirer family, but there was no published material apart from some letters that Jaspers had found, but they could be interpreted differently. So I think the situation was, until Peter found this material and was editing it, there was no clear case to say that Heidegger was openly anti-Semitic. He was one of the people who could compromise with this regime from the viewpoint of his own political and philosophical ambitions. But he could also stand up after the war before the commission and when he wrote his report to say that at least I tried to diminish the damage that was already being done to the Jewish colleagues at the early phase of the transformation of the university. And so I think one should not. It's important to see it in this context that those of us who had been sort of defending almost the right to read Heidegger, which was the situation in Sweden, not least, and maybe also in Germany and other places, were saying that there was sort of a red line, and I think this explains partly why this has had such a massive impact. At a quite rapid pace. I mean, some certain very symbolic events that have taken place in the aftermath of this. Günther Figal, who resigned as a president for the Heidegger Gesellschaft. Peter can tell long stories about the internal collapse of the Heidegger culture in Germany with very bitter feuds. In France, the whole Heidegger community is falling apart. Former friends are now bitter rivals. I mean, it's created a lot of stir, yeah. And François Stastur is no longer speaking to Jean-Luc Nancy, and so it's some very symbolic.
Well, it's really. I want to support this. Excuse me, but I can give it back to you. Just to say that
feel free. But
you really have to understand that, in, for instance, the Bundesrepublik Germany, that I will take a very actual topic of our discussions, the relation of the Bundesregierung to the refugees. Wir schaffen das. Angela Merkel. That's an effect of the Shoah. That's still the actuality of the Shoah. The Shoah as a founding event of the new Bundesrepublik. And we never had, like what you said, what Hans said, we never had a clear statement of Heidegger about the Shoah. And that was, of course, good for Heidegger. It was that gave us a little safety to deal with him. And for instance, to deal, you see that many of the scholars or of the philosophers dealing with Heidegger, Levinas, Derrida, Lyotard, they are all Jews. Huh? So and now we have a statement where he says Auschwitz is the self-annihilation of the Jews. So, and you cannot say that doesn't change something. That changed really, literally everything, actually. So I will support that. That was a huge, absolutely huge impact because this event of the Shoah is not comparable with to say there was always anti-Judaism. No, that's something different. The Shoah is in the reception really something what is a interruption of history in a certain way. It's the beginning of what we would call today East German, and it's an event of identification of identity. So in this respect, I would really say it is something absolutely new. I never expected this. Never. I never expected such crazy and weird ideas about world Judaism in this philosophical on this philosophical background.
It's even in a way worse, because he doesn't, of course, advocate the Holocaust. He doesn't know, but he writes in a vein. I mean, you quote. I have your book here from things that really puts what he calls the Weltjudentum not only as something as an object or for his anti-Semitic passions, but as an agent in his whatever eschatology that he now has, which is the nationals. It was sort of linked to the appearance of what he thought was National Socialism. I really have to read this because I read it in German, but it's Die Frage nach der Rolle des Weltjudentums ist keine rassische, sondern die metaphysische Frage nach der Art von Menschentümlichkeit, die schlechthin ungebunden die Entwurzelung alles Seienden aus dem Sein als weltgeschichtliche Aufgabe übernehmen kann. And if I briefly translate it, the Jews, the world Jewry, it's by its uprootedness, is an agent for uprooting. Am I more or less translating this properly? Everything, so that's... And then the question is, and then maybe you can continue, whether he metaphysically, nevertheless, wanted to do away with the Jews. Not physically, but metaphysically, he clearly thought that was a good idea.
Even though this is an important distinction.
Yeah, it is.
Because
but this happens at the same time when Jews are actually physically...
This is why this is so shocking, and I think we all react as sensible people in the same way, with sheer shock and almost horror at this statement, even though, and this sort of brings me to my two next points, the fact that now the question of Judaism is suddenly on, and the Hebraic inheritance is now suddenly explicitly on the screen of Heidegger's philosophy, not just as a marginal thing, what he did or would not do with the Husserl family, or whether or not he, etc., all of those small details. But what the Schwarze Hefte has done is to, and this is what Peter takes up in his book, is that it's inscribed into his thinking, which forces us, if we are to take him seriously, to understand what this means. And this I take to be part of the what we've been trying to do here today. And I must say I've found this conference and this meeting extremely interesting and worthwhile, and it's forced me to start thinking in terms and with the help of concepts that I did not feel earlier that I needed to work with in order to understand Heidegger. But through your work also, and I think this is so. It's from the sort of theological, philosophical viewpoint. If we see this as a common field, suddenly Heidegger's work becomes even more important to think through, precisely because he has introduced these categories into his own thinking. And some of the interpretations that we have tried to deliver here, I think, are maybe beginning to make sense of this, and maybe in a little bit somewhat different vein than Peter's book, which you try another line of argument in yours. But this is so it's clear that part of the discussion on Heidegger in coming years will take this route, and it proves that the theological learning is now suddenly not only useful but maybe necessary in order to understand where Heidegger is heading, because now it's more clear than ever to what extent he's working out his thinking within the context of a theological and religious framework. And this is, I see, as the only way of beginning to make sense of these statements, and this is what you were saying basically also through your historical reconstruction. So I think from that point it seems like, ironically maybe, that he becomes an even more important point of work from the theological viewpoint. Now I spoke too long. I have another point in relation to your question, but I'll save it.
Yeah, so George and Judith, mainly then, must there be and should there be, and how should it look like, a theological response?
I'm sorry, can I stay with what's been said?
You can stay with that.
If not reject, at least to kind of offer some resistance. Because it seems to me that coming to the Black Books as a sort of naive reader, if you like, that were a naive reader to come to these as a document, they would indeed discover someone who made anti-Semitic comments, who was anti-Semitic as an adjective. I don't think they would discover an anti-Semite, that is someone whose worldview is, as it were, shaped by anti-Semitism. I mean, it seems to me that the comments about world Jewry are foolish, not thought through, lazy.
What if they are thought through? This is
but I see no evidence in the Black Books for them being thought through. I mean, they're just totally banal, commonplace comments. And I think in terms of, as it were, weightage of words, one would find equally culpable, as I say, England and the English Revolution. I think so. One would find Americanism as well. Now, of course, there is a certain kind of anti-Semitism that would, a real anti-Semite would, of course, say, well, world Jewry is pulling the strings of America as well, because it is the country of the uprooted, and all uprooted people are Jews, as it were, though clearly many of them, particularly in the early 20th century, were actually Germans, and Swedes as well, of course. So, it seems to me that this is not an organising centre of the work. It's lamentable, it's despicable, but it's intellectually lazy. It's not what's driving it.
That makes it very easy for you. It makes it too easy, I think. Why don't you take it seriously and then try to argue with it?
I'm not saying I'm not taking it seriously. I'm just saying that it's not intellectually interesting.
Okay.
No, I agree with George, and I think we can concretize this by looking at Christian anti-Semitism in juxtaposition with Heidegger's. For a long period in Christian history, much Christian thought was anti-Semitic, and in a much more central and essential way than Heidegger's anti-Semitism, because for the Christians, the Jews were those who killed Christ, and that made them cursed and deserving of anything that they could, have coming to them. Whereas, exactly as George says, Heidegger's anti-Semitism, Jews are just another exemplification of the metaphysical homogenization and so forth that he sees everywhere else as well. I mean, the comment that you quoted from the Black Notebooks is an interesting one, because he says, the Jewish problem is not a problem of race, but the problem of a way of life. And of course, it's not just the Jews who have this way of life; it's so many others as well.
Why does he call them the Jews? Then you can invent another name.
No. He does obviously think that the
way
Jews
of life you can give a name. But he gave it this name.
Sure, look at.
He also gave it the name Bolshevism.
No, well, we don't want to argue. Okay, okay,
well, why not? I mean, one should have an argument.
No, I don't. To me, because I'm a Jew,
No.
It strikes me very hard.
No, that's too easy. Of course, you know that if you have at first, I think it's interesting. We could discuss whether there are interesting kinds of anti-Semitism or not interesting kinds of anti-Semitism. I think it's where there is a clever and smart anti-Semitism and only a banal anti-Semitism. Rosenberg, was he a clever anti-Semite, or Hitler, he was very clever and Heidegger is not, or something? Well, I don't know. So,
I think you're mishearing what I said about interesting. I just said, limiting myself to the context of Heidegger's Black Books, that what he says about world Jewry isn't intellectually interesting. I'm not implying that there are interesting forms of anti-Semitism. I'm just saying in the context of Heidegger's work, he has interesting things to say about the thrownness of Dasein in being and time. He has incredibly important and interesting philosophical things to say about many subjects. What he says about world Jewry is intellectually uninteresting.
And I mean, could one add to that? Would it be a useful
take the microphone then, so then give it back to Peter.
Sure. Would it be useful to draw a distinction between a kind of anti-Semitism where there's something particular and unique about the Jews that makes one look down on them, and an anti-Semitism where the Jews just exemplify something that we see in lots of other places as well, because that I think is a useful distinction. And there's, anyway.
Well, I don't know why he.
At first, I guess we have to. It would be we have to do that. We have to do this work to contextualize, of course, Heidegger's statements about the Jews into the field of discussion from this time. And you see that, for instance, if he speaks of Bolshevism, Americanism, liberalism, like to say that there is a discourse where all these isms are figures of world Jewry. So world Jewry is really a key word for this kind of world conspiracy. So Bolshevism is actually controlled by world Jewry. Americanism is nothing else than what Hitler calls the Finanzjudentum. So that's actually world Jewry. So I would say. I don't understand this difference, to say that there could be something, there is something interesting in Heidegger and there is something banal, and we have to expulse the banal, we shouldn't deal with it, or we shouldn't take it seriously because it's banal. That seems to be a little bit a petitio principii. It's like you decide what is banal, and obviously this is banal, and no, that's not a problem. For me, it's is not a possible hermeneutics actually, and yeah, the last thing is what was I saying? Yeah. No, let's stay here.
Hans also wanted to come in. Okay, George, you...
Very brief. A Jewish colleague of mine in Oxford who teaches Heidegger in Oxford begins his lectures on Heidegger as Heidegger was born, Heidegger died. That's all you need to know about Heidegger the man. Now let's open Being and Time.
No, we're talking about his writing, George, not about the man. This is the writing we are talking about. Go on, Hans.
So 2 points. I mean, I think Peter and George's differences here is interesting as an illustration of a more general hermeneutic problem, which is maybe in the end ultimately undecidable. Because what you're saying, George, when it says that this is not interesting, is precisely that it's marginal. That is, we don't have to deal with it. And Peter, what you have done in your book, in my view, in an exaggerated way, but you've done it, is to try out what would it mean to reread Heidegger's most basic philosophical idea from the viewpoint of these new findings. And this is what you try to do. So suddenly the history of being is reinterpreted through this particular perspective. It's an hermeneutic experiment. Time will show whether it holds or not. But who can finally make that choice? I mean, this is what happens. We have to try to read it. We can refuse to read it. I can just mention one example of this from my own work that also brings up the question of whether or not there is a pure Heidegger in the 20s and then somehow a perverted Heidegger in the 30s, if it starts in 29, 31 or 33. I've been teaching Sein und Zeit all my academic life, and I wrote my dissertation largely on this book, and specifically on this fascinating chapter on historicity. So why was historicity so interesting? I think what Heidegger has to say about historicity is a way of performing a phenomenological, ontological exploration of what it means to be historical, to exist in a space of tradition. And he continues Nietzsche's way of thinking about this from the second untimely meditation, and he produces a phenomenology of historical existence, which in my view still is an incredibly profound reflection on this problem. For Gadamer's hermeneutics, they are more or less based on this chapter, to think ourselves as existing in the space of tradition as something which is more original than history in the chronological sense, and to understand ourselves from this viewpoint. So this is, I think, a theory which still has a profound validity for memory studies, for studies of tradition. At the same time, It's precisely in this chapter that he says and suggests that there could be something like an authentic historicity. There could be a way of existing authentically as historical. And he exemplifies this as the possibility of affirming one's generation in the moment and of existing in an affirmed collective existence with one's generation and one's folk. So he basically says that there is a way in which we can occupy this space in which we are essentially thrown, behind which we cannot come, and which is the only way that we can open a future, but that we can do so authentically. And this is the point where his own version of a kind of Gemeinschaftsphilosophie is opened up. And it's not incidental that he says to Karl Löwit when Löwit asks him in Rome, so what is the philosophical basis of your commitment to National Socialism? Well, it's my analysis of historicity, precisely. Because historicity has to do with affirming a sense of authentically existing within and with one's community. And this is precisely the tragic fate, or we should not maybe poeticize this too much, it's the sad fate of the German political history at this juncture, that nationalism, this radical nationalism, comes up as the political solution to the desperate problems in which they found themselves. And with German nationalism, the 50 years that sort of preceded this moment in 1930 is also the moment when anti-Semitism really becomes a powerful political force. And this is because anti-Semitism and nationalism, you cannot separate them in Germany. It's almost produced at the moment when Germany is unified, something has to go out, right? So you unify a country which is Catholic, Protestant, with a lot of differences. So who is the odd person? It's the Jew. And this is what, once we come into the early 30s, this is exactly what happens. Somebody does not belong in order for this community to experience itself. And sadly, Heidegger is sort of maybe the greatest philosopher in his generation. I think he was the greatest philosopher in his generation, opts for nationalism as his own philosophical task. And at that point he activates his own philosophy, and the anti-Semitism comes with it. So even though he's not an active anti-Semite in his political and educational dealings, and he's somewhere sort of mellow, the drastic things are the things you find in the diary, it is connected. And to me this means that I cannot teach this material in the same way after having thought through this, because suddenly this problem of an authentic historicity is also the internal problem, not just of Heidegger's nationalism, but of all nationalisms, and the question of community and its exteriority. This does not mean that this theory is not profoundly interesting, but in its own extreme consequences, it brings with it precisely this problem. Just as one example.
May I introduce, I don't have time, it's another, I mean, that's so interesting what you say that at this point in time, his idea of authenticity, of living in a community and all this, or what comes with it, is crystallized out in this. What, if we were thinking, what in this kind of thinking could crystallize out today? We are in the same human predicament. We are lost in space, or nothing has happened, and we see a world that is also a bit shaky in its foundation. I can see, that there might be a link between Heidegger's longing for a new beginning. It's an archetypical human thought. Coming into new, radical, revolutionary, not necessarily nationalist, but other ways of thinking, that it could come back in a new form. And if so, I mean, a critical reading of Heidegger would be very important. I trace links between, and this is also rudimentary, but this is the idea in certain left radical philosophical circle of the event, of something sort of almost out of history that will sort of change. Alain Badiou, French philosopher, has written a book, also almost paraphrasing Heidegger, being an event, and the event is I was saying, and he has also served Paul, of course, for this purpose, the same way you discussed him this morning, Hans.
Yeah, can I pick up the question and push it in a slightly different direction, because I would want to avoid Badiou, but the question of what can happen today in relation to Heidegger's philosophy, let me say what I think is an important task for people working on Heidegger. There never was a strong right-wing Heideggerianism in the post-war period. There were very, very marginal figures. Heidegger was mostly picked up in left liberal circles in the English-speaking world. In Germany, a little bit different, ambiguous. But today, there is a right-wing Heideggerianism. In Russia, there is Dugin, who has personal relations to von Hermann. So there is a sense in Europe in which sort of right-wing Europe is now grasping for this reservoir of mid-war thinking. And this is something that requires, I think, the more precise and scholarly, and I would say radical readers of Heidegger's to emphasize what is precisely what the productive part of this inheritance, which involves today discussing precisely the critical aspects that we have today. But then I would go back to what George was saying also. Heidegger's most profound thought is not his anti-Semitism, it's not his vulgar nationalism that he at times glides into in some of his most extreme Hölderlin readings. Heidegger's most profound thought is the thought of a thinking in original exile. It is thrownness. It is the awareness that as we find ourselves in the world, we find ourselves thrown. That is, not being able to return to any kind of pristine origin, but having to think from within this finite thrownness. And this is, I think, also one of the reasons why these very, very smart young Jewish scholars found him so attractive and so much more vivid than many of the more boring neo-Kantian scholars. He had a sense of what it means to think from within this intellectual experience of exile. And this is what we need, apart from all the other work that we have to do to really emphasize today.
Anyone else wanted to comment on this? The potential for good and bad of recurrent Heideggerian thinking. Let's say the basic Heidegger then.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I mean, that, if one thinks about the thrownness of our time, I mean, it's always very risky, isn't it, to imagine. I can't remember now who it was who said, there was a time when we might have looked to Heidegger as an oracle to sort of tell us what to think. But someone said that earlier in the discussion. But I think actually that's always difficult, and in a sense, part of Heidegger's value as a philosopher is that he tells us that that's just what we shouldn't be doing, that we should be, I mean, as many philosophers through history have told us to do, should be thinking for ourselves on the ground of our thrownness, in our singularity of our situation. And, when one goes back and tries to find historical oracles, I mean, one just ends up with the debates of the schools. That clearly, I have colleagues who regard Kant as the evil power behind modern nihilism and the Holocaust, who take Eichmann's plea that he is acting on Kantian principles at face value and say, therefore, Kant is to blame for the Holocaust. Others, of course, would see Kant precisely as the prophet of a libertarian, rational cosmopolitanism, and the opposite of anything of that. And one can go back to the great thinkers of the tradition. Most of them are susceptible of very varied and conflicting interpretations. But I think one of the things we can learn from Heidegger as a philosopher is precisely that we, in a sense, one can only think, and of course, as he is always rethinking the tradition, but doing so precisely in a dialogue with his own situation, much as he hates that word, of course, but as it were, out of the need of the present.
But he sees Hölderlin as oracular.
He does, but of course he also says that Hölderlin is not a prophet, not a philosopher. Hölderlin is a poet, and that is something else again. And though the philosopher thinks in proximity to the poet, the philosopher himself never becomes a poet, and the poet is not to be read as a philosopher.
I'll leave it to Peter to sort of. Then I will open up, if you so wish. You are in the midst of this. You will remain there for the foreseeable future. So, what's your what do you see the future of Heidegger in contemporary life?
In contemporary,
No less.
nothing actually. No, just to continue what Hans said. In our situation, I think what we are aware by, in a certain way, by these anti-Semitic ideas is that there is something in Heidegger's philosophy who, in a certain way, predetermined this kind of thinking for these anti-Semitic. How could you say that? That he is able to take this on or off into his philosophy, this openness for anti-Semitism. What is this? And I would really say that, and this is something what is very important today. I said it before. Maybe it's quite simple, but it's this anti-universal character of this thinking, And this is really something what betrays. And therefore, I think throwness is, in a certain way, indeed, also a very complicated and problematic concept. This anti-Platonic, anti-universal character of Heidegger's thinking is something what in our situation is, makes him attractive for people like Dugin, who speak from you, or Razia for right-wing people who try to now in the discussion about the refugees to strengthen up the national state again, cultural identity. For these kind of discourses, Heidegger now is rediscovered, and I guess that this is really the problem in Heidegger, that he is really in my view a radical anti-universalist. So far that he really can say that actually the Germans are the people of the being as such. Yeah? The Germans are the people of the event. And these myths in the center of Heidegger's thinking are, in my view, very very problematic and for a continuation of this kind of philosophy. So that's. So in this respect, I would say there's a lot to do to make him attractive again for a creative and productive project of philosophy today.
The idea of authenticity, as Hans mentioned, is very crucial to him. It seems that in the present chaos, or the present lack of authenticity perceived, and that is which is fanning all kinds of movements that are promising nationalists, as you say. You don't see that some Heideggerian thinking. We have seen one example that you think that it can be reworked and revived and re-entered into political action in a way.
Well, only in of course, in an anti-democratic sense. Well, of course, this philosophy is anti-democratic. That's not a wonder. It's not a miracle to say that. But no, I really would say that. Take for instance Derrida, somebody who really tries to be very creative with Heidegger, But nevertheless, in Derrida is something deeply ethical, what we cannot find in Heidegger. That's the concept of justice. Justice is for Heidegger a concept what he only rejects, what he denies. For him, justice is Americanism, And we have this in Derrida, and therefore you can see that the Derridarian continuation of Heidegger is something what is like the Levinas continuation is indeed deeply rooted in an ethical idea. But this is not in Heidegger. You cannot see something what what is ethical in this sense in Heidegger. So
It's interesting. I sense that the theologians among you are much more reluctant to give up on Heidegger than the philosophers here, or not give up, but sort of make some conclusions.
But maybe it's because we had lower expectations to begin with.
Is that so?
Certainly true. Certainly. I mean, I agree. I think the ethical is not a very strong component of Heidegger's thought. I don't know whether he has much to say to the political conversation. Picking up on what you asked before about authenticity, I think the sort of the cultural conversation, certainly his early thought still contributes to. I mean, even just the straightforward critique that's implied in his early work of the very superficial ideas of authenticity that rule our culture as a sort of, there's this core of myself which I just have to discover and then be true to. It's something that he thoroughly deconstructs in Being and Time. That's as relevant as ever. But of course, there is a serious question about whether the thought of somebody who in a sense constitutively can't contribute to the political conversation is by that very fact compromised. I'd like to hear from George.
I think Judith's first comment was right, but I'm going back to Derrida as well. I think, that's clearly right, and yet how Derrida thinks the ethical requirement, or Levinas for that matter, is not as, in terms of Enlightenment, universals. And most of my colleagues who are moral philosophers in the Anglo-Saxon context, would abhor Derrida's approach to ethics, because they would say that it precisely makes ethics impossible, because it is focused on what is singular, what cannot be repeated, what is perpetually different, and indeed at a point where I think Derrida's focus on singularity and eschatology is indeed part of his learning from Heidegger, that of course I entirely agree that there is an ethical impulse, a demand of justice, but that is, as it were, an existential in a sort of non-Heideggerian sense, perhaps a more Kierkegaardian sense of responding to what is actual, rather than, as it were, as a formal principle. But yes, I think theology maybe, of course, has other sources than Heidegger to draw on, and other orientations. And I think perhaps to think that thinkers can, as it were, provide norms for complex political communities in the face of complex needs is an unrealistic expectation to start with. But that might, of course, be part of the problem of a certain intellectual tradition, that it sets itself up in this way, the thinker as sage.
Hans, you wanted to...
Yeah, just... you wanted to open up?
No, I said we have time. It's okay.
We can talk about this for hours.
Yeah, but I'm interested, so I think everybody is.
No, since you summarized this saying that the philosophers were more reluctant than the theologians, but I would just like to say I cannot see how this new affirmation of universalism, as you suggest, Peter, could be such an easy solution as it seems. This was, of course, to some extent Habermas's general critique against all of what he summarized under this neo-structural or post-structural thinking at an early stage. And I think this is if you move as quickly as that and let the profound disappointment that I think we all share as readers of Heidegger's in relation to his anti-Semitism, then I think we lose something which is, on the contrary, very important to continue to develop, because there are many cries today for universalism, and they are certainly not always honest political alternatives. Today, universalism perversely is becoming the cry of the far right. This is what's happening in France. The French revolutionary values.
They would not agree.
They are now kidnapping these universal Enlightenment values, and it's clearly targeted against minorities. So we have a situation in which we have to think very carefully. And I would say that not only in Heidegger but also in Husserl, it would be harder to accuse for being an irrationalist. What he considered to be his own most important contribution in terms of the history of rationality was precisely its inability to think itself in its own origination, because universalism and rationality must be thought on the basis of singularity. Even Husserl says this. Even mathematics, even logic, has to somehow include an historical reflection on its own genealogy. And why is this important? Well, it's important because if it doesn't do so, then this universalism and rationalism will itself become a blind and amnesic kind of matrix, which is another version of nihilism. So this kind of reflection, this inner reflection on the universalism of rationality is, I think, part of a legacy of phenomenology that we should not simply disparage because of our shock in the face of Heidegger's anti-Semitism.